being here. You might have noticed we pulled a moderator switch. Other room. Emma will have the director of the honors program. Excited to get to be here in this room for Jennifer's presentation on 5 years of the film titled Who Is She? And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over. We'll have questions afterwards, time afterwards for questions, and from her advisor to presenter the honors stole she'll wear at graduation. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer. So this is my honors thesis called Who Is She? It's about the forgotten pioneers of film. So my introduction, women in film are important. Yeah, that's the whole reason I wanted to do this thesis, was just to make it clear that it's very important for women to have a place in film. And so throughout my film classes here at St. Edward's, I learned a lot about these women and how they were kind of like on the back burner compared to a lot of men in the field. So it made me want to dig deeper into where these women are inspired from, what they did, and just why they're kind of left out. Because they played such a vital part in developing the film industry we have today. So this is the main question I had when writing my thesis. Why are so many women pioneers, and what leads them to break free? A lot of these movements that I found out that these women in film discovered, they are so influential into what we have today. And so I think it's really important to take a look at why they're creating these movements and what is leading them to do this. In order to find this, I focused on two women, Guy-Blache and Agnes Varda, two French filmmakers, and I will discuss them further. But first of all, I want to define a film movement because I'm going to be talking about it a lot. It's a wave of films that take place in a specific time. So as an example, I'll be discussing the French New Wave, which is the movement that Varda heralded. So the French New Wave took place from the late 50s to the late 60s. It's one of the most well-known movements, which is why it's really cool to me that I get to talk about Varda for it. A film movement also takes place in a similar geographic area. So as with French New Wave, it took place on the streets of Paris. This is kind of an important part of a movement because there was a similar movement going on in America at the time, but because it was in America, it's not considered part of French New Wave. So the geography is really important. But what's most important is the editing factor of a movement, which for the French New Wave consisted of like jerky editing. It took place on the street. There were a lot of natural people and settings. They didn't really use any like special lighting. They just used film that would be able to take in the lighting of the scene. They also wanted to focus on bringing film back to the people, so they were really disenfranchised with the Hollywood system at the time. So it was sort of just like a return to the people's film. Anyone can make a film. This is what's important to us right now. So the first woman I will be talking about is Guy-Blache. She's a French filmmaker who was born in Paris in 1873. When she was 21, she went to work as a secretary for Leon Gaumont, who ran a photography company at the time. This job was vital in providing her with everything that led her to be a filmmaker because she had access to all of the new cameras at the time, and she actually was in charge of learning how to use them so that she could demonstrate them for clients. So after she worked for Gaumont for a year, she got permission to use one of his cameras called a Biograph. That was a 60mm camera, and she used it to shoot and direct her very first film, which was The Cabbage Fairy in 1896. A lot of people have regarded this as the first fictional film ever of all time. There's a little bit of a debate between some film historians, however, because records are usually non-existent this far back because this is the very, very beginning of film. So either way, she created one of the very first narrative films, and that's incredibly important because most everything we watch now is fictional. The film was only a minute long, and yet it changed the course of film history forever. Before this, filmmakers were really only documenting things that were around them. They would go out and film people getting off trains or film boats pulling into harbor. But Guy-Blache created a story and filmed a story so that people could begin to tell stories with film. After her first film, Guy-Blache moved to the US and she created her own film production studio, which was such a huge thing for a woman at the time. It was called Solax Films, and it was in New Jersey. It was very, very successful, and after 2 years, they were making over 100 films a year, which is really a lot when people weren't making films that much anyway. At the height of her success, however, her husband decided he wanted a company, and also he wanted to use her studio, so it ended up putting her own company out of business, and they used his company. But they continued to produce extremely successfully and distribute films, and she was incredibly important at the start of this movement. However, there's little to no historical accounts of her. I literally could only find one book that had a semi-detailed biography of her, so it's kind of crazy that she played such a large role and yet there's such little literature on her. She was the one who heralded the silent era, so this is the first ever film movement and era. It was just the beginning of film where there was no sound, they were in black and white, and they were often really, really short films. The second woman I will be talking about is Agnes Varda, who is my favorite filmmaker of all time. I love her so much. She was born in Belgium in 1928, and as a child, when her parents moved to southern France, she would visit this boating town called Point Court, which ended up becoming the inspiration for her very first film, which actually was the precursor to French New Wave. It's called Le Point Court. When she was 18, she moved to Paris to go to school, and her mom gave her her very first camera. She studied at the Sorbonne and studied literature, psychology, art history, and photography. She basically just did a bunch of photography jobs to stay afloat while she was in college, and then after she finished, she decided to go make her first film, which was Le Point Court. And right before she left to go make that film, she ran into Alain Resnais, who was in charge of Le Cahiers du Cinéma, which was a film criticism magazine at the time, and that's sort of where she just met everyone who would eventually go on to become the main directors of the French New Wave. So the way that they knew her and then she went on to make this film, they all kind of were inspired by it, and that's what led to the movement. The film was created in that small town. She only had 2 actors acting. The rest of the people in the film were just people who lived in the town, so it was very much like a combination of documentary and fictional film, which kind of went on to be the mantra of the French New Wave. Like I said, they wanted to take it back to the streets, so this combination of just little fictional parts with mostly documentary is what created that movement and how it became so important. Varda continued to be one of the most important and trailblazing women in film throughout her life. She actually passed away in March when I was first in the middle of writing my thesis, and it was really sad. She created fictional and documentary films, and a lot of times these were very, very radical, so she really was making waves at the time. She actually even made a documentary in 2017 that was nominated for an Oscar, so she was one of the few women who stayed relevant past the French New Wave, unlike a lot of the directors at the time. And one of her main focuses was that she wanted to bring the voices of women back into cinema. She always talked about how women in film were being written by men and shot by men, and then women watching these films were accepting it as the way they were supposed to be, even though a woman had no way, she didn't contribute at all to writing or producing the film. She thought that she needed to write these films and portray them in the way that women actually lived, and her influence on modern women filmmakers is really incredible because a lot of them still will cite her as one of the main inspirations for their films. So not only did she pioneer one of the most well-known film movements, she gave women a voice in film in a way that they hadn't before. So like I said, I've talked a lot about French New Wave, but I just wanted to include the shot from one of her second films that was in the movement. It was called Cleo from 5 to 7, and it was about a woman who was waiting. She had 2 hours to find out if she had cancer, and so even though it was a fictional film, the film almost kept time exactly with the 2 hours that the woman was waiting to find out. So again, it was mixing the documentary and the fiction that was so important. So now that I've discussed the 2 women that I focused on in my thesis, I want to discuss just exactly what led them to becoming pioneers. So in order to do this, I looked at a bunch of different texts to try and find out just what led them to this, but one of the primary texts I focused on was Linda Nochlund's 1971 essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? This essay was really about art history, but I found it really poignant and just helpful to look at through the lens of film. It talked about the different standards women were held to in the arts and just how they compared to other men in the scene. So this was really relevant to both Varda and Guy-Blache because the essay was actually written after both of them had already become prominent in making films, so it especially applied to things in their life. So I came to 2 conclusions through my research. One, I found out that there is little support for women filmmakers at a young age, and also that a lot of women creatives at a young age are taught to prevent competition with men. So even though these may be a little bit less relevant in the modern day because women have made further strides in film, it was very, very prominent at the time for them too. So the first conclusion I found was the lack of support at a young age. So this is discussed in Naucklin's essay when she talks about the term genius and how that can make or break a young creative. So she talks about a lot of young male artists who show talent at a young age and they're just labeled a genius. Their parents are like, wow, he's so good, he's a genius. We need to make him not work, he just needs to concentrate on the arts and develop his career. So a lot of these men who were named this when they were really young, their fathers or their uncles were artists, so they could just give up on work and focus on making creative. And then they learned the tricks from the masters and just developed and had careers really early on that most people would have taken almost their lifetime to develop. It was really helpful to them because they were able to acquire these skills, but for girls, they were not allowed to, they just weren't labeled geniuses. If you were a girl and you showed creative passion, people would just write it off as a hobby. Say you need to take care of your family, you need to do this is just a hobby for you, this isn't an actual career. So, by not teaching these creative girls the art at the time, they were forced to create their own way and have something completely new. This can be seen with both Guy-Blache and Varda. Neither were nurtured creatively, and therefore they used the resources they had available most of the time at their jobs, like with Varda's photography or Alice Guy-Blache's secretary job, to create films that were entirely new to what existed at the time. The second conclusion I came to was that women were supposed to prevent competition with men. So Nauckland talks about an etiquette book from the mid-1800s that discussed how women weren't supposed to become really, really skilled in one aspect. Their feelings were basically supposed to come second to their husbands, and they just were not supposed to be competitive at all with men in a professional field. So using this, Nauckland argues that women are continually taught to reduce their competition with men by not becoming skilled. And this idea, which is, although incredibly wrong, we know now, probably influenced these women filmmakers, especially Guy-Blache, who began making films just 40 years after these books were around. Because these women had internalized this idea that they weren't supposed to compete with the men, they broke free from the types of films that the men were making and made something that was completely their own. This breaking free put them in a totally different field than the men filmmakers at the time and helped creative women establish film movements that had not existed before and that still influence us today. So why it matters, it's kind of crazy to me to talk about why we should care about women in film because I feel like it should just be inherent. But, you know, girls watch movies, they see that the women in the movies, how they act, and they just internalize that. And if everything being produced is by men, there's just no way for them to understand that their stories are being told in a specific way. So these women were coming in here and portraying stories through their voices as women, and then other women were watching this, and now that's why we have so many filmmakers and people have the ability to make stories that represent them and not have to watch stories being told by people who aren't them. So I think it's very, very important to understand the women that we've had in history and their achievements in order to grow today as a society, especially in film and outside of film.
Are there questions for Jennifer?
What was the most surprising finding that you discovered in the research?
I think a lot of the things that were surprising me were like with Guy-Blache, where her husband just decided he wanted a company and then it put hers out of business. And what was really interesting about her that surprised me a lot was that the Library of Congress actually ended up getting the copyrights to all of her early films. And then when she came back to America in the 30s, she wanted to get copies of these films so that she could build an archive of her own. And the Library of Congress was basically like, we don't have any copies of these. So they were all copyrighted, but that's why she made like thousands of films, many films in her time, and they maybe have like less than 100. So she never got control over her own films, and she never had archives of them. And it's just crazy to me how much she was left out. Like obviously she was really, really important, and the things that she did were super important, but just reading about how everything was taken away from her was just really, really crazy to me.
Did you find any modern day like replacements for those two that are influential today?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of women filmmakers who are important today, but because I guess they're still prominent today, they haven't there's not really literature about them academically. So I mean, there's Greta Gerwig, who a lot of people know. There's Sofia Coppola. There's a bunch who are really prominent now who are making films, but since it's not past their time yet, they haven't done the same type of thing, or they haven't been documented doing the same type of thing as these two women.
Do you think that these pioneers would be satisfied with the amount of opportunities and outlets that different women, queer women, non-binary, and people of color, or women of color, have now, or do you think that there's still a long way to go?
I think both. It's easy to look around and be like, wow, we've done it. Women are making films. This is it. But there's always room to improve. And even if you look at statistics now, only 13% of director nominees at the Oscars have been women. So I think even though there's a lot more place for women to make films now than there was back then, and they would definitely be excited about that. I know Barbara was. She definitely talked about it now, and she collaborated with other people. I would say they would think there would be strides too, just because you can never stop moving forward.
Yeah.
So, as a consumer, what would you recommend I do to help?
I guess just support filmmakers. It's really easy just to go to the movies and watch every new Marvel movie that comes out, but if you take the time to research and go to small film festivals and just support local independent filmmakers, it starts from the local level, and if people just help the local filmmakers get up, and they make it to the Sundance level, and then they can make it to Oscar level and things like that. So I guess just paying attention locally and going to small showings and things like that.
Thank you so much. Advisor, Professor Sybil Miller, up to give her the stole that she'll wear to signify her honors, distinction, and graduation. Thank you so much.
I'm really, really honored to give this to you. I can't wait to see you wear it at graduation. It's been a real pleasure to work with Jennifer on this project this semester and actually be educated by her on this subject. I'm very interested in film and video work, and I've worked with Jennifer mainly in photography and video classes, so this has been a unique opportunity to work on something that's a little bit different and a more historical and analytical approach to something that we do that's hands-on. So I've really learned a lot,